We've been going through a series, if you remember, on David. And if you remember, we've seen a lot of different things that have taken place. So we're all the way to the 17th study that we've done. If you remember last week, we saw what he's so noted for was his sin with Bathsheba. And so you think about it, if you go to 2 Samuel chapter 11. Yes? Okay.
Yeah. I had heard on the news the other day that, I don't know if it was a leader in India had said he doesn't want any more conversions. He was making a ruling of no more conversions.
That is correct. So far as that, he's very strong Hinduistic, and the beliefs are becoming more and more militant. Before, they were open to others. The Muslims have been that way for a long time in India. Your communists have got a real strong, the Maois got a real strong setting there too, and they're also coming into these tribal areas, promising different things. And now the getting very strong Hinduistic stuff. So that's why there have been so many killings of Christians because of it. A lot of these have been burned out. Their stuff has been, churches have been burned, families have been beaten. So, and they've run into the woods for hiding, and then obviously with wild animals and things like that. So yes, it is very real, and this opposition is coming from all sides. Even though the written statement is one way, the actual statement is another. They can turn the militant, the police and stuff, turn their head and allow the beatings to take place. So that is very true. Very true. So if you look at it, I'll give you one to think about here. I think in verse 27 of chapter 11, then I'll tell you what I'm talking about today. 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse 27. And you notice the very last statement after this has happened. Uriah has been killed, and she's expecting. And then notice it says, and when the time of mourning was over, which was 7 days, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife, and she bore him a son. Notice the thing then. But the thing that David did was evil in the sight of the Lord. I think it's important to recognize that because of chapter 12, it's a year later. Why does God wait a whole year? You know, you think about it. In our life, we love it when he waits, right? When we mess up, give me all the time in the world, and if you never do anything. But in this case, he waited a year. And I think one reason is important too, because so often you think David got away with something. Everything's going exactly the way he'd planned. You're going to find today it wasn't going real well for him. But from the outside, it looked that way. But also, you think about it in Daniel chapter 4, you remember when Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel goes before him and tells him he needs to change his ways, his pride, and things are going to get him in trouble, and he doesn't listen. Remember, it says, and 12 months later, then he went wandering around, went in. So I think what happens, God's time frame, according to Peter, is not like ours. He's on a totally different time frame, but he is going to do it. So I want to think about when you have it. I think it's interesting. In Proverbs 27:6, you remember it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend. It's interesting when you look at it. Swindoll, I was reading in his book, again this last week, the literal Hebrew translation actually would put it this way. Trustworthy are the bruises caused, the wounding of one who loves you. So somebody who loves you is going to bruise you. How many of you are just excited about having somebody come up to you and nail you one? Because you need it. And it's interesting. I remember Shelley might remember, may not. It was a year or two ago, and I said something to her, and and she called me up short on it. I wasn't intending for it to be given that way, but I could see when I thought back on it how she could easily have taken it one way. And so it made me think, okay, is that a dark spot? Could I be doing that with other people? So all of us have dark spots we need to think about. Are we coming one way, but it actually can be perceived as something else? I'll never forget when I was at the refinery, we started this safety program on Wednesdays, and it was with Sunoco. And the guy who was a bigwig, the vice president, he come down, he had ruled with a rod of iron. Whatever this guy said at any of the 5 plants, it's exactly what happened. If he wanted your job, he came in. If he said get rid of Sam, you're gone. It doesn't matter who you are. Well, he comes down after these safety meetings, and what happens is you do the meeting about 15 minutes, and they open it up. Anybody have questions? Nobody usually says anything. Well, Well, people are going to go to lunch that day. I know 2 of them had their spouses coming to the refinery, and they're going out to lunch. We go through it from 11:30, 11:45, we're supposed to leave. Anybody have any questions? The vice president, normally never said anything, he flew in from Philadelphia. He decides to talk. He talks for 30 minutes. No notes, just rambles, doesn't say anything really. Now what do you think happens to those people who are supposed to meet their spouses? Are you going to get up in the middle of that meeting and go leave? No. So people weren't too happy. Well, Richard, the one who trained me and who was very vocal, and he also was one who was a millionaire and just worked there because he wanted to. And he told me, I remember later, he said, I can say what I want because I don't need this job. He smokes. He goes to the smoker, and this vice president was in there right after the meeting. The person said, Richard, what have you been doing lately? And Richard, I have to clean up his language, said to him, I've been listening to this guy for the last 30 minutes. You can fill in the rest of what he had to say. And the vice president looked at him and he goes, that's what I was doing, was it? And Richard said, that's exactly what you were doing. Now, how many of us have the courage to confront somebody when they're doing, basically you just want to hear them? But it's interesting. So how many of us have the courage? Think about that when you look at this text. Starting then, the courage to confront. Notice in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1 to 12, David sent Nathan to David. Now, how would you like to be Nathan? God, the Lord, sent Nathan to David. How would you like to confront him? Remember, what did David just get through doing? He committed murder, he did other things, and how would you like to be the guy that go confront him, the most powerful man in your country, and tell him what you're doing is wrong? It's interesting, Swindoll had some statements. Whenever you confront some people, you need some things you need to do, and it fits real well with what you have here. Notice, first of all, the right timing in verse 1. Notice it was a year later. Why didn't he do it a month later? Why didn't he do it 3 months later? I think it's important. Anytime you confront anyone, it needs to be the right time. I suggest if you have something to say to your spouse and they just put a double shift in, that's not the time to do it when they come home. Right timing is everything. It really is. So notice the right timing. And notice the second, the wise wording. Notice how he does it. Obviously from his background, at the end of verse 1 and down through 4, there were 2 men in one city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a great many flocks, and the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and nourished. And it grew together with him and his children. He would eat of the bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the wayward who came to him. But rather he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So notice, how does David present the story? He goes to David as being a shepherd, right? Basically, in the story, we know who the different people are. David doesn't see it coming. Notice those wise wording. He thought about it, the Lord giving him the words to say, and he's thinking about how to present it to him. Really important for all of us to think about our wording when we confront someone, or they confront us. And notice in 5 and 6, the solid truth. Notice David's anger burned directly against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. Now where is that coming from? David knows the Old Testament, Exodus 21:16. If you kidnap, you're supposed to, that's death penalty. If you go to the next one, then he says in verse 6, he must, basically pay him back fourfold. That's coming out of Exodus 22 and verse 1. If you stole a lamb, you were supposed to pay back fourfold. So notice David knows his Old Testament, which, by the way, he didn't practice it in the previous chapter. But notice what he's doing. He has right timing. He has wise wording. And notice the solid truth. And David immediately comes to the verdict. He deserves death because he kidnapped, and he needs to pay back fourfold. Now that all goes just great, right? So we've done 3 things: right timing, wise wording, solid truth. How about fearless courage? Notice 7. Nathan then said to David, "You're the man." Whoa. How'd you like to be the one that says you're the man that just stole? And he obviously would know immediately who the lamb was. You stole Bathsheba from the poor man Uriah. Okay, so notice then what he says. It's interesting, he goes through it. Isn't it I who then delivered you and gave you this? And so, because, you notice in 9, you despise the word of the Lord, you've struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, have taken his wife to be your wife, you have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Notice, he's saying, who killed him? David did, because David gave the order, and then gave the order to pull him back. So David was the one responsible for it. So notice this wise wording. I think it's interesting when you see it. And then notice how he's then going to punish him, and he's going to punish him in a fourfold way. And from this point on in David's life, he's punished within his house, and there's no peace the rest of his life. He's punished fourfold. Now, it doesn't mean he's not forgiven, but I think it's interesting that he's punished. I think one other thing you can have when you talk about this thing, so courage to confront, you have the right timing, you have wise wording, solid truth, fearless courage. But then I think the last one, which isn't here, it's in Galatians 6, and you can turn there for a moment, is humble attitude. Humble attitude. And I think it's important for all of us when you have it, when somebody confronts you or you confront somebody, to have a humble attitude. And notice what it says in Galatians 6, 1-3. It says, "Brethren, if any man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit," notice of what? Gentleness. You go with gentleness, and then notice also in verse 3, "If anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." Realize it could be us tomorrow. So I think it's important to go with a humble spirit, but recognize all of us have dark spots, all of us have mistakes. So it's interesting, from this point on here, you're going to find something different in David. But notice then, so the courage to confront. Think about this for a moment if you want to ask you a question. Am I open to be used by God to confront somebody else, a friend? How many of you see things but you're not open at all? How many times God may be wanting you to go talk to that friend, all right? It has to be the right timing, right wording, and so on. But how many of us would say no? That's somebody else's job. Second thing is, am I open to be confronted by a friend who may be used of God? How do we respond if somebody comes to us? Mind your own business, right? Take the log out of your own eye, right? How many of us are open to go, and how many of us are open to receive? I think it'd be a lot better in our community, because I think we'd be acting more Christ-like, because we would be taking things out and the non-believer would see it. And so often we don't. Notice then, you go back to 2 Samuel, notice then not only the courage to confront, but the challenge to confess. And notice what David, in verse 13, the Lord said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Did he deny it? Nope. Right up front. "You're right. I confess." And it's interesting, he confessed, and notice Nathan's response, speaking on behalf of the Lord, he said what? "The Lord has taken away your sin, you shall not die," which he should have died. Old Testament law, notice that's grace. He committed murder and he committed adultery, Old Testament, Leviticus, both of them he should have died. Okay, I'm going to punish you, and he tells him he's going to punish him fourfold, but I'm not going to take your life, which he could have. Again, that's God's grace. But because it was a public sin, he's the leader, God has to punish him. And the other nations, you see that, what he has right there. Notice what he says in verse 14, "However, because of this deed, you have given occasion for the enemy of the Lord to blaspheme. The child also who is born to you shall surely die." Notice the child would have been 3 months old by this time, roughly. And he's now, the rest of the chapter talks about then the child dying. Again, our sin affects other people. And I think it's important for all of us to recognize there's no such thing as doing something that doesn't affect somebody else. If I make a poor financial decision, it affects my family. If I say something, it affects my family. So think about it. Courage to confront, and then the challenge to confess. The consequences are there. Is there something I need to come face to face with and see it as God sees it? That's what confess means, to acknowledge it and see it as God sees it. The devil didn't make me do anything. I chose to do it. We blame the devil for a lot of things. But he can put the temptation there, but I'm the one who either does it or doesn't do it. But what happens is the story doesn't end here. Right after he's confronted, David writes Psalms 51, and then he writes Psalms 32. Let's look and see what he happens to write, which doesn't happen to be here. Look over in Psalms 51 and see if we can learn from this, because all of us will make mistakes and have dark spots that we need to confront also. Psalms 51, you'll notice at the top, it says when he wrote it. It says he wrote it when Nathan confronted him. And notice what it has in verse 1 down to verse 7, he asks God to cleanse him. Notice the basis of what he wants, and God's character. Why do I want you to cleanse me? Notice in verse 1, be gracious to me according to thy loving kindness. In other words, you and I go to God according to Hebrews 4 for grace and mercy. David is going to him and say, hey. And notice he also uses in the end of verse 1, according to thy great compassion. He appeals to him on his compassion. He appeals to him on his loving kindness to forgive him. You know, David doesn't say, look what all I've done for you. Look at all these great things I've done as a king. None of that. The basis of me asking forgiveness is your character, God, nothing to do with me. No matter who we are, it's God's kindness. And notice that he asks a lot of different things when he wants complete cleansing. Notice he asks for, at the end of verse 1, blot out my transgression. Blotting out means missing the mark. Whenever we sin, we miss the mark, God's mark. He wants you to wash me. Notice he uses the word cleanse me. He wants to be completely cleansed. Later in this chapter, he says, I want to be as white as snow. Only you can do that. Notice David recognizes only God can do it. So notice when he is confronted, he then sits down, he writes this psalm, and it's between him and God. You and I need to do the same thing. People can confront us, but how of us then sit down between us and the Lord, and we write our confession to him. So he asks us for cleansing, and it's interesting, verse 4, he says, against you I've sinned. Obviously, anything we do to other believers or non-believers is ultimately sin against God. And he recognizes his sin nature in verse 5. It's interesting you look at it. So here he has a confession that you have, wants to be cleansed. And notice how bad it was. And remember, we thought he was getting away with it. Notice in verse 8, it says, make me hear joy and gladness, let the bones which thou hast broken rejoice. Was it having an effect on him over this last year? His health was affected. You'll find this when you get to Psalms 31 as well. He was being affected internally. A lot of things were going on. So on the outside, it looked like everything was going well. Inwardly, he was falling apart and stuff going on physically. So he wants to have this restored. And it's interesting. Notice him creating me a new heart. I want to have a spirit that's steadfast. Don't cast me away. And notice 12. Restore me to the joy of thy salvation. Was he a happy man this last year? No. Outwardly, everything's going great as a nation. He's doing a great job as a king. But he's fallen apart inside. And notice, once he's confronted, he sees it. He's confessing it. Hey, I want to get back to where I was a year ago. Now think about it. How many of us are willing to ask God to cleanse me? Then I want you to restore me. But it's interesting. I don't know how many of us would do this. Verse 13. Not only cleanse me, restore me, but notice, I want you to use me. Notice what he says, that I may teach transgressors thy ways. I want to use my experience when I blew it to teach others so they won't blow it. This is what he writes about so much in Psalms 31. I think it's interesting in 32. It's interesting how many of us, when we have confessed, we want to then close the book and we don't want to talk about it. We don't want anybody else to know about it. And that's often what, but how many of us are saying, okay, if somebody can learn from my experience and how I blew it, and I can keep them from doing it, I'm willing to do that. And that's what David is saying here. I want you to do that. And he then is going to praise. You'll find more of this. Notice what he also talks about God. You don't want to sacrifice. Notice what God does want is in 17. Sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A Okay, he doesn't want David just to come bring a sin offering or a transgression offering, which he needs to do, but God wants a contrite spirit. He wants to see what's in. Do I really change from the inside? So notice then that's what David's wanting to teach. Go then, after he writes this psalm, go over to Psalms 31, and let's see the other one that he writes. Interesting, or 32, I should say. Which, by the way, when David is asking this, before he started in 32, what David is actually asking is, God, change me from the inside out. How many of us are trying to change ourselves from the outside in? How many of us, really, and I think if you look at people, we oftentimes, how many of us have this little criteria for being a Christian? And we have all these outward things they need to do. They need to do these things, they don't do those things. We're trying to change from the outside. In Romans 12, remember, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be what? Transformed. That's the Greek word metamorphosis, which means what? That's metamorphosis is what happens to a caterpillar to a butterfly. It's changed from the inside out. If I want to be truly changed, the Holy Spirit changes me from the inside out. Then that's true change. So look when you get to Psalms 32, he was going to write. Interesting how I have it. Do I really desire this change? Notice in verse 1 and 2, the blessings of forgiveness. How blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How blessed is the man whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and whose spirit there is no deceit. The blessings of forgiveness. It took him a whole year to do it, didn't it? And it took him a whole year before somebody confronted him. Could David have done it beforehand and never having? He could have. But he didn't do it, so somebody came to him. Nathan did it, the courage of Nathan. Notice the next thing that he has on it. The burden of the unrepentant heart. Remember we said how everything looked like it was going just well? When I kept silent about my sin, my body wasted my way. Through my groanings all day long. Day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was drained away as the fever, feverish heat of the summer. How was it affecting him? It was terrible. But remember, on the outside, people thought one thing, and it was terrible. How many of us have had the same thing? Things are just going terrible, and we know what it is, but we won't do it, and we'd rather be miserable than because of pride, rather than step up and just say, I'm wrong, and I blew it, and I need forgiveness. It's amazing how many times that we are that way. What I find so amazing is David is willingly writing this for who to see. For all of us to see, so we'll learn from it. It's interesting. Notice then he was going to write the beacon for others, and notice it's interesting. In verse 5, I acknowledged my sin to thee, and my iniquity I did not hide. I confessed. I acknowledged it. I told you what it was. Obviously he was confronted. Notice he didn't argue, he didn't say anything. He said, yes, you're right. But notice then he wants to be a beacon to others. Notice what he wants to do in verse 6. Therefore let everyone who is godly pray to thee in time when thou mayst be found. First thing he wants you to notice, he wants us to go to him when there's an opportunity. And then if you notice the rest of it in verse 8, I'll instruct and teach you the way you should go. And he's then going to give some analogies. Don't be like a horse and don't be like a mule. What was David saying he was like? I was stubborn like a mule. Learn from my mistake. How many of us are willing to go out and put in writing for everyone to see that I blew it and I was stubborn like a mule and I was a fool? I mean, that's amazing. Remember he said, Lord, use me, and I'm willing to teach others, and I want to teach others, and I want them to trust you and walk with you. And so I think it's interesting when we look, how many of us are that way? How many of us are really stubborn and we don't want to, and we justify our actions? I told you that it's been 20 years ago. I remember I built up a wall. I've told you this several times. My younger brother had done some different things, and I started building up a wall against him. And unknowing to him, I started doing the things, he's obviously serving the Lord, doing a great job, but I, started building up a wall against him. And, of course, when you do it, how many times in your own mind do you keep putting another brick on, keep adding it, doing things. It had no effect on him, but it had an effect on me. And it's interesting, the Lord then showed me, just like He did here, showed me, hey, you know what you're doing is wrong. So I called him on the phone, we had a great talk, and he had no idea. But I had to confess because it was something that I was doing that was wrong. It was amazing, within 1 month or so after that is when you all asked me if I would come up and speak one Sunday. And 18 Sundays, 18 years later, I'm still up. Why did I not do it earlier? And so I think it's interesting. Pride gets in the way for that. And we can blame it and we can say, yes, he was some things that he did. And when I spoke to him about it, he recognized it. He said, well, it wasn't what he was intending. Great conversation. But how many times are we building things and making walls that we had no business building and let God do it? Let's think about it. How can we apply this today? Am I open to be used by God to confront a friend? No, that's Dan's job, right? We all have time. Am I open to be confronted by a friend who may be used of God? A friend comes to you, and what happens? We build all the walls, and we're not open. You know, granted, we want the right timing, we want the right words, we want truth, we want courage, we want all that. We won't come with a humble attitude. What do I need to come face to face with and see as God sees? If you look in our own life, is there something that I need to look at and say, hey, you know, that's a dark spot I need to address. It's interesting, from this point on in David's life, you do not find him taking any more wives, concubines, any other sexual sin that he committed the rest of his life. Recorded in Scripture. Now, he paid for this one, he paid for it the rest of his life, but he does come to grips with it, and he does change. It had been going on for a long time, and he changed. What about this one? Am I willing to use my failures to help others? It's amazing how many times we'll go listen to athletes, or people will go listen to someone who's on alcohol or drugs or whatever, and then God uses them and changes them, and we'll listen to them. Well, you and I have a story too. What are we willing to take our failures and then help others who may be going through something similar? And I think that's one of the reasons why Dalton Hill has been around as long as it has, is because we basically are taking people who are, and all of us who are broken, have been mistreated or whatever it might be. We want to then restore them and then back into service, serving Him. So think about it. Am I willing to use my failures? Willing to use my failures? Willing to use my failures? Willing to use my